So hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on how governments can work with automation and AI. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of the Global Government Forum, a publishing house that works with civil servants all around the world. Now, in terms of today's topic, governments around the world are examining the potential to use technologies like artificial intelligence and automation, ultimately to improve public services. It helps to reduce errors, reduce costs, and speed up delivery. But the implementation of such technologies, however, is often difficult in government. So it can be difficult to introduce changes to existing systems, to existing cultures, and often getting the funding can prove tricky. And the use of automation and AI is also not without risks and possible unintended consequences. So transparency and trust are really key considerations. We've got a fantastic panel today, and we're going to be discussing all of those issues and more in a moment. And then once we've heard from our four great speakers, we will move into questions, many of which have been sent in advance by our global audience. So in terms of our panel today, first we will hear from Jeremy Darrow, who is Head of Artificial Intelligence at the Scottish Government. He says he's passionate about the potential of AI to improve people's lives. And in his current role, he leads on the development and use of trustworthy, ethical, and inclusive AI. His experience spans over 20 years across industry, academia, and government, including in aeronautics and astronautics at MIT and computational biology at the University of Cambridge. Then we head over to Israel, where we'll hear from Tom Dan, who is Deputy Director General at the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Technology. As part of this role, he leads the Israeli government's work on setting up a national strategy on artificial intelligence, including looking at the regulation, ethics, and implementation of AI in the government's own work, as well as fulfilling the government's target to bring up the labour force participation in the tech sector to 15% of the total workforce. Prior to joining the ministry, Tom was a senior manager at the consulting firm McKinsey and the senior international editor of the Huffington Post. Then we will hear from Harry Farmer, who is a researcher at Ada Lovelace Institute, where he explores ethical and policy questions posed by new and emerging uses of data and AI. He currently leads AI and Genomics Futures, a 2-year mixed methods project being conducted in partnership with the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. Prior to joining the Institute, he worked as a senior policy advisor at Nesta, where he developed and advocated for policies to make the UK's innovation economy fairer, more inclusive, and more conducive to the public good. And then last, but by no means least, we go over to Canada, where we'll hear from Christos Sarakinos, who is Director of Data Science Division at Statistics Canada. And there he leads the work on data science solution delivery, capacity development, and research. Between 2014 and 2021, he worked to stimulate collaborative research and development in the areas of advanced analytics, natural language processing, and machine learning at the National Research Council of Canada. And he's also served as senior policy advisor at the Privy Council Office of Canada, developing advice related to big tech. So I'm sure you'll agree we have a really stellar panel with us here today. I'm really excited to hear what they say and also to hear how they answer the questions that have been posed by our audience. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Jeremy to give us his opening remarks. Over to you, Jeremy.
Well, thank you very much. Hi everyone, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to participate in this panel. Really look forward to our discussion. So just I'm not going to speak for very long, but just to give you a little bit of context and just to echo what you were just saying, that in Scotland we recognise that AI has a huge potential to help develop better government policies and deliver better public services and wider benefits to the economy and society. So this is why we developed an AI strategy for Scotland, which we published in March 2021. And the stated goal is to make Scotland a leader in the development and use of trustworthy, ethical, and inclusive AI. And our strategy supports directly the delivery of the objectives from the National Performance Framework, which sets out the high-level, top-level objective of the Scottish Government. But this is a strategy for Scotland as a whole. This is not just about the public sector. And we want to ensure that Scotland maximizes the potential economic and social benefits of AI. And this is why we're working closely with industry, with innovators and educators to build the best environment to encourage growth and innovation and investment and adoption of AI across the economy and across the country. So we've brought together all these stakeholders in what we call the Scottish AI Alliance, together with the public. And the Scottish AI Alliance is all about collaborative leadership, collaborative delivery, and it has a really broad program of work. And if you're interested, you can find out a lot more about it on our web and social media channels. Or even better, if it's okay to just do a quick plug, please do come to the Scottish AI Summit, which will take place on 28th and 29th of March in Glasgow in Scotland, and also online. We have a really amazing lineup of speakers from around the world. It's going to be a really exciting conference, so please do come along. So now just coming back to the core of our topic about AI in government, I think one of the unique features when working with AI in government is that government is really held to a higher standard. I mean, in a well-functioning market, bad AI will be eventually weeded out through consumer choices. But as a citizen, you just have no choice when it comes to interacting with the government. You need to interact with us whether you like it or not. And yet that interaction tends to have a really major impact on your life. So government as a social responsibility, which I think is also an opportunity to really lead by example and set the bar when it comes to the responsible use of pardon me, of AI. And in particular, I think what's really important is not just to, write strategy, which government is really good at, but what's important is to translate those high-level principles, for instance, around ethics, into best practice and, to turn them into reality. And I think it's particularly important for some of the more sort of difficult and long-term problems that might not be an economic priority for the private sector on their own. So I do think there's an opportunity for government to step in and resolve some of those market failures. One of those problems that is common to everybody is, how to make AI trustworthy. And this is very, there's many different components to it. From, thinking about it from a public sector perspective, one of the sides of it is to earning the trust of the operators of the AI system and public sector workers, so that they trust the system and that they actually use it and use it well. So that ties it into questions of explainability, for instance. And the other side of this is, of course, earning the trust of our citizens, and that brings us to the whole topic of transparency. So these are very broad topics, and to tackle them, we've been working in close partnership with the private sector using an innovative R&D and procurement mechanism we call CIFTech, which is a type of GovTech accelerator, if you wish. Because if you have the privilege of working in government, like some of our panelists, you will know how painful and inefficient traditional government procurement can be. I mean, really, to me, I've worked in other sectors, I do think is really the worst possible process to innovate. So in Scotland, we're trying to do things differently. And in the CIFTech process, what we do is we start by putting out a call for tender that it's much more broad and open than typical public sector procurement. as we know that there won't be any off-the-shelf solutions to those very complex issues. We then select a handful of companies to refine the problem statement. We don't jump to solutions, we spend more time on the problem. And we do that for about a month during what's called the exploration stage. And then we select one company to co-develop with us as customer a minimum viable product over 3 to 6 months during what's called the accelerator stage. And then if this is successful, we then have the option of signing a pre-commercial agreement with them and later to go to procurement to implement the solution. So we found that this is a really great way to co-produce solutions to those complex problems. It's very agile, and because you're progressively building things before you buy it, it really lowers the risk and gives space to innovation. So there's a few projects that we've been working on. One of them is we've run a challenge on using AI to improve accessibility to online public services, particularly for disabled people. And in this case, we brought together teams from the policy team around augmented and alternative communications within the Scottish Government, partners from NHS24, which is the government agency in Scotland that provides remote urgent medical care, and the AI team within the Scottish Government, which provides some technical expertise, and the CIFTEC team, which runs the process. And we found that through that collaborative process, we're really able to tackle issues and move at a pace that I never thought we could in government. So it's been a really good experience. And just briefly, another challenge, and again, I can elaborate a little bit more during the Q&A, is around transparency and enabling public trust, but also agency. And we've been working on this with a Finnish startup called SideOut. I can't discuss all the details yet because this is a really sensitive use case, and we're just about to launch a conversation with the public on that topic. But essentially, we've been working over the last year with the public sector organization to develop a system to help keep children safe from harm, essentially in the physical world. And what was interesting is we thought that the focus in this project would be really on this facilitating the public dialogue. And we decided that one of the objectives was to build a public register as a basis to do this, as towns like Helsinki and Amsterdam have done, and Ontario and so on. But as we went along the process, we realized that before you could get there, before you could have that conversation with the public, we needed to have an extensive dialogue within the public sector organization itself, because the organization was at a very initial stage on its data maturity and AI journey. So we needed to put in place tools and processes to do that. And instead of just building a public register, a website, we've been working on a much broader platform that is going to help this organization and other public sector organization to have those internal conversations, to put in place best practice AI governance, and also to connect this governance layer with an API to the actual technological layer. So there's an API that's being developed with Databricks and Azure. So I do think there's a huge space for innovation in government. I think we need to do more of it. I think we undersell ourselves. And I think that also we can play a key role in sharing that knowledge, sharing lessons learned, that we make open the tools and the process that we've built. And one of the things we're doing in Scotland is that we're developing what's called the Scottish AI Playbook, which is a practical guide to how we do AI in Scotland. And we recently launched it in beta version. We'd crowdsourced the resources just using a simple wiki. And we're in the process of developing user journeys, of identifying gaps, so that in the end, this is going to be a one-stop shop for anybody wanting to work with AI. Where do you start to be an informed customer? And of course, maybe just to conclude as well, we're keen as Scottish Government and Scotland to be a team player, to be a good global citizen. So we are contributing to the development of AI standards and regulation across the world. And it's really great today to be able to have a conversation with members of other countries. But I'll just stop there for now.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you so much. A lovely way to open the webinar. Really like what you said about the importance of collaboration. So you've set that picture of working across the public, the private sector, but also with academia, kind of educators as well. So really important there. Shameless plug for your summit in March, but please do share that information. But also what you say there about the use case is really interesting. So everything from kind of access, improving accessibility to public services, to working on really sensitive issues like the keeping children safe. You know, AI has this ability to be deployed across a huge range of policy areas, and the public sector and governments as real leaders in this to set the standards and share their learnings for others to show how it can be done in a trustworthy, ethical way. Loads of issues there that I'm sure other people will pick up on. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And now, Tom, I'm coming over to you.
Perfect. Should I get going? Or
yes, please do. You
No problem. So what I'll do is I love Jeremy's comments, and I think I'm going to build on a few of them in my talk. The main point that I want to make is that I think unfortunately a lot of the discussion around AI is around the fantastical, futuristic. Is there going to be are we all going to lose our jobs? Is GPT-3 going to take over human beings? Is it at the level of human beings? At the end of the day, for public servants, there are very practical, tactical elements that are needed in order to enhance the public system. So very specific use cases for AI to improve your healthcare system, your social welfare system, your tax system. And I think the bread and butter is implementing those, and we are unfortunately very, very far from doing that. And so that's kind of the main takeaway from my point. If we want to click really quickly through the first few pages, the next slide. So Israel is ranked very high. This is Stanford's Vibrancy Index on AI, 9th in the world. Another click. Tortoise is another ranking where we're ranked 5th, but when you dive a little deeper, you see that everything that has to do with the government strategy, operating environment, and infrastructure are all, we're not quite as wonderful as we'd like to think that we are. And so while R&D and those components are fantastic, the government has quite a ways to go in order to properly introduce AI and regulate it. Another click. Lots of countries are publishing AI strategies. Another click. And so I want to spend most of my few minutes just talking really about what it is that, in my opinion, governments should be doing and what Israel is doing on AI specifically. The first and foremost component, so the right-hand side, you see industry. Industry, I mean, Israel has its innovation authority that supports startups and helps them. There's also the private sector that has its VC money. And so I want to put that aside for a second. On the left-hand side, you'll see the government implementation. That piece, and Israel is going to commit roughly $500 million over the next 3-4 years, specifically to that component. Government implementation of AI includes, anything from in the healthcare ministry, implementing really smart image recognition software in order to help doctors understand MRI images and better prioritize MRI images that they are looking through, or pathology. So if you're looking at Pap smears, right? Today, a lab technician is the one looking at your Pap smear and deciding whether there are abnormal cells or not. These are things that computers know how to do, or AI knows how to do today, and want to help accelerate that. In the welfare ministry, AI has capabilities to use data from the police force, from the health ministry, to really understand that child in that kindergarten or that school might be in danger and might be worth having a social worker visit them. Unfortunately, the welfare department doesn't even have the data in a single data lake. So we're quite a ways to go for some of these ministries. Ministry of Health, by the way, is doing amazingly. But my point is just some ministries are very far behind on their digital journey. Some are closer. And Siobhan and Jeremy mentioned this. This is a really big point of who, at the end of the day, at the ministry is ending up to deciding those projects and leading those processes. And it's not always easy. I'm guessing we'll talk about it later as well. There are a few other areas where we're starting projects. The process will be a competitive process where our ministry, the Ministry of Science, Innovation, Science, and Technology, will provide 50% of the funding. The ministry implementing the solution will provide the other 50%. And it'll be done in a competitive process across ministries and across vendors. That's on government implementation. Research, human capital, and infrastructure. So research, we're spending a lot of government funding on supporting research in academia, as well as human capital. And there's a question of how do you create the next generation of AI professors and PhDs and postdocs? And there, it's not so easy because in the US, with the private system, a lot of solutions whereby a professor or a postdoc spends 50% of their time in academia, the other 50% they can advise AWS or Google, and really kind of get a lot of money for perfectly honest on this one, right? In Israel, there are certain flexible models where you could do it 1 day a week, but we want to make it more flexible so that really your academics can spend some time in industry, can make more money, but also get that talent into academia and kind of capture it and bring it in. Regulation and ethics. We've launched the Israeli AI regulation paper. It's still under public review. And so I'd encourage everyone watching this also to send us your comments. We're looking for comments from all around the world. And we have a translated version of this document. And the document basically says, every regulator will regulate AI in their own area. We will not be creating an AI law in the same way that the EU has created or Canada. We are much more of the ilk of the United States, the UK to some extent, Japan, Singapore, whereby there isn't an overarching, broad brush stroke law. Every regulator will regulate AI in their area as they see fit. But at the same time, the counterpart to that is how do you provide those regulators really the support and bolstering so they understand AI and they're not scared of implementing it. And here, there's a cautionary tale. I think Israel has some of the biggest fintech companies in the world, Lemonade and Melio, these huge unicorns in the fintech space, while at the same time, Israel got Apple Pay only last year, Israeli citizens. And that's not a coincidence. The regulators are used to working with 4 big banks and 5 big institutional investors, and it's a simple world. And when you want the regulators to go ahead and start working with thousands of small fintechs, digital banks, insurtech companies, et cetera, it requires a shift. And what you need to do is provide the support to the regulators so that they know that if things go wrong, they are not alone. They're not the only ones making the decision. And this is a big point in the regulatory process, as well as in the implementation process. I mentioned the welfare solutions. If there are issues of privacy, again, the implementers need to have the protection and the tools to be able to implement those solutions. Last 2 are data governance and international collaboration. International collaboration is one of the most important things for Israel. We based our regulation in large part on the OECD regulation. We are in close contact both with the OECD, GPAY, the United States, OSTP in the White House, as well as the UK and a bunch of other countries in terms of government collaboration. I really think this is an effort where if we don't work together, we won't be able to provide kind of a strong, responsible, innovative approach towards AI. At the end of the day, the role of government, in my opinion at least, is to step out of the way, let industry do what industry knows how to do best, while protecting citizens and while implementing the best in class in the government. That, at the end of the day, is our job, in my view. Sorry, I think I went a little bit over time, but happy to.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dan. Really interesting to get those examples from Israel, to hear how it's going on there. I think your key messages there of much more could be done. There's potential to use this a lot more, but actually some of those big challenges, interesting what you say about the regulators needing more support, needing more help so that they can understand this better, but also the implementers. So some of the, I'm sure for our audience that will be interesting, is some of the officials that are having to make decisions about these, they also need support and a bit more understanding in how they can do this, and how they can maybe trial some of these things and potentially fail without that being held against them as well. So lots again there to unpick. And I think you echoed some of what Jeremy said there about the role of government being a kind of setting the standards best in practice, but also you're saying getting out of the way when industry can do things better than they can. Thank you so much, Tom. Again, lots to think about there. And now, Harry, I'm coming over to you for a slightly different perspective, because you of our panel, you sit outside of a national government. So it'll be interesting to get your perspective on things.
Well, thanks so much. It's been a really, really interesting conversation so far. Absolutely agree that I think there are interesting and worthwhile threads that we'll be able to take up in the Q&A session, particularly from my perspective, from an organisation that worked quite a lot last year and continues to work on questions of AI regulation, these questions about whether a vertical or horizontal approach is best. I think that would be something interesting to pick up, because it's pertains to questions that we've grappled with as an organisation. For anyone interested, continuing on along the theme of shameless plugs, the report that we put out at the end of last year called Regulate to Innovate captures some of the thinking that we had at that particular point in time around how government should be thinking about the regulation of AI. But in terms of what I want to talk to today, there has been so far, and I expect there will be after me, a fair amount of optimism, and dare I say at some points even boosterism, about the current and potential applications of AI and data-driven systems within government. And I think this is completely understandable. These technologies are in many ways very impressive. And doubtless there will be some ways in which they stand to improvement, improve how government operates. But I also think that we have to be incredibly careful about how, where, and indeed if we deploy AI systems in high-stakes settings like government. Government is arguably one of the highest stakes settings that you can have for the use of emerging technologies. And I really want to make two broad cautionary points here. One of which is about the limitations of AI systems as they exist currently, and therefore what sorts of tasks we can reasonably and responsibly assign to them, and how they might interact with existing decision-making or service provision systems. And the other point I want to make is around the dangers and the risks that come with delegating decision-making at a micro and at a macro level to autonomous systems. And in particular, how the use of AI systems can conceal, obfuscate, and insulate value-laden decision-making from human and sometimes from democratic scrutiny and control. So firstly, on the limitations of AI systems, in the context of government, I think you're either going to be using AI as a rudder or as an oar. That is, as a guide to decision and policy making, or alternatively as a replacement or a complement to service provision, so helping with the actual provision and the business end of things. So if we take these in reverse order, so firstly thinking about how AI might be used in customer service, I think you run into a couple of main problems. The first of which is that systems, AI systems that exist currently, tend to be fragile and domain specific. We have systems that can't cope with nuance and strange new cases. You know, a particularly visceral example of this is one of the versions of Uber's autopilot needed to see hundreds and hundreds of examples of a particular kind of cruiser motorcycle before it could identify that that was an object that it shouldn't crash into the back of. So systems are very dependent on having seen very specific training examples. They're not good at dealing with novelty, which is something that in a lot of service provision contexts, you're going to have systems to be good at. So that's a hurdle that has yet to be overcome. Now, I think more recently, with generative AI, so things like DALL-E, things like GPT-3, we're getting to what looks to be more generalist systems. But critically, the limitation of these systems is they're not truth tracking. They essentially will generate something which isn't founded on any kind of theory of the underlying world. With something like ChatGPT, there is no correspondence to the truth of the statements and the text that has been trained on. Essentially, it's giving you an autocomplete suggestion. So you essentially have these systems which are very versatile at superficial level, can produce very convincing sounding text, but cannot be guaranteed. And anyone who's tried and played around with these systems for a few minutes will see this quite quickly. They're not constrained by the truth. So I think that's a particularly dangerous combination. And I think if we're thinking about the capacity for AI systems to become more generalist, we really should be very wary about seeing generative AI as any kind of evidence that we can entrust AI systems in more generalist sorts of contexts. So essentially, you have this choice of narrow, fragile systems on one hand, or versatile, insouciant, for want of a better word, systems on the other. And in complex service provision settings, this basically means you need humans in the loop to step in when systems can't cope, or to audit the responses of systems to make sure that they are kosher, to make sure that they are in line with what we would want responsibly to happen in those circumstances. I think given this, it's really worth considering whether it's worth introducing AI shortcuts in the first place in lots of instances, if you're not going to completely do away with humans, and if you're going to create failure demand that frustrates people and undermines confidence in the system. I think it's also worth keeping in mind, if you're still going to introduce those systems, if it passes that bar, it's really useful to keep in mind that we need to keep systems domain specific, and we need the cost of standby humans. So the humans that we are keeping in the loop, we need that cost, because humans are obviously expensive, to be borne equally by different parts of the system. We need to avoid circumstances in which some providers within government service provision, for instance, decide to do away with the human in the loop because they can trust other parts of the system to hold on to it. And I think there's a moral hazard that we need to be really conscious of when we're thinking about the application of AI across whole service provision systems. So those are some of the limitations of AI on the service provision side. Now thinking about AI as a guide to policy. Here you might, for instance, be thinking about using something like predictive analytics to provide insight on health and care needs of a population, for example, or maybe to make suggestions about resource allocation and process optimization. Now, in these sorts of settings, I think you run into some fairly familiar problems. So it's pretty well understood, but bears repeating that AI and data-driven systems have issues regarding poor accuracy. They have issues regarding differential accuracy, where systems are more accurate for some groups and some demographics and some individuals than others. And also some pretty well-documented issues with machine bias. I'm not going to talk too much about the underlying problems there, because I think they are fairly well understood and there's a lot that's been written about them. But really, I just want to talk about how we respond to these problems and how government decision makers might respond. Because you might think, and you often hear, that the solution to this is simply to collect more and better data to train these systems on. And I want to point out two related problems with that idea. So firstly, you need to keep in mind that problems of bias aren't necessarily just data problems. They're problems with the fundamental methodology of these systems. They're related to the fact that AI systems don't have any conception of the causal connection or lack thereof between different data points. And that's something that you can't fix just by making sure that your underlying data is accurate and broadly representative of the population or of the subject matter that you're studying. Now, to get around this problem within the confines of big data and AI, you essentially have to brute force it. So to collect so much data that the causation correlation problem doesn't matter. And I think we have a tendency maybe to underestimate how high a bar that is. If you're doing anything involving humans, this results in massively invasive amounts of personal data collection. Now, I know this is the point where a lot of people start to roll their eyes, but this privacy point really does matter. And I think in contrast from what you might infer from people's behavior, so the fact that people use a lot of privacy invading services in their day-to-day life, when asked specifically to consider these questions, the public don't want to share huge amounts of their data. They are sensitive about it. They are conscious of the power that they give away when sharing their data with third parties. And I believe government should respect people's considered rather than their revealed preferences on this issue. And I think, as Jeremy also pointed out earlier on, we don't have any market choice when it comes to using government services or being subjected to data collection on the part of the government. So I don't think we can take market revealed preference models as acquiescence on this point. So really, I think the upshot for policymakers here is not to over-rely on data analytics for policy intelligence. Often the amount of data that you require is prohibitively high, and there were maybe better, more sensitive, more dynamic ways of getting insights to inform policy. So those are a few warnings about the technical limitations of AI systems. And now I want to turn really quickly to a point about some of the political implications of using AI in government. And this has a couple of different components, one of which is about delegating decision-making within government to AI systems. And here I think we might assume that there can be a pretty clear division of labor between accountable humans who are making value judgments on one hand, and on the other hand, AI systems which are providing purely technical insight and recommendations. What I want to suggest is that in reality, this boundary is a lot muddier than it might seem. And given the muddiness of that boundary, there is a risk of value-laden decisions or assessments, which should rightly in democratic societies be open to scrutiny, being made by AI systems, and therefore concealing those value-laden decisions which undergo them. And also, given that systems can be optimized in different ways, so they can be optimized to achieve different outcomes, I think there's a risk that AI systems are used by public servants to provide recommendations or decisions of the near of objectivity or impartiality that, in reality and on reflection, maybe they don't always deserve. And this takes me on to the second component of this worry, which is that if AI systems conceal human value judgments, the question of who controls and chooses and designs these systems becomes a lot more than just a dry procurement exercise. In particular, there is a worry that if government bodies start to rely on large private third parties to provide data and AI services, they are potentially giving up a lot of non-trivial control over how public services are actually run and how public policy is actually formulated. And we have to ask at this stage where these arrangements start to undermine the principle of democratic control of public services and democratic accountability for policymaking. Not suggesting this has happened yet, but it's certainly a dynamic that we need to be very aware of and very conscious of, particularly when government can't get out of a lot of these contracts easily, and where the nature of the influence had by AI systems on these decision-making processes can be very subtle and can be quite hard to diagnose. So that's a very condensed summary of some of the things we need to be conscious of when thinking about AI in government settings. In terms of upshots for government, I think there's a lot that could be unpacked. But now what I'll say is be very mindful about the fundamental limitations and what these systems can and can't do, and conscious of the control you're giving up when you delegate decision-making to AI.
Thanks, Harry. I said I knew you would provide a slightly different perspective, and you did tell me when we were chatting through that you would provide the cautionary note, I think. So a lot of those issues that you've raised there about the possible risks of using this, really interesting, giving that different kind of take on this, looking at dangers of delegating the decisions to machines. So if you still need humans in the loop to monitor all of that, then making sure that it's worth doing in the first place, and who bears the cost. Really interesting there, if you're working across government systems, who bears the cost of having those humans in the system. Need to think about things like that. Issues around the data there, not just the accuracy of it, but also the invasive nature of it, privacy issues that governments need to respect as well. And then some of those big issues around kind of the scrutiny of the value judgments and democracy itself in terms of how those are being applied. So thanks, Harry. Lots there. I'm sure that our other speakers want to come back on some of that when we go over to the Q&A. I might have a bit of a debate with you on some of those issues. But last but not least, we go over to Christoph. Over to you, Christoph. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Wow, Harry really set the stage with a bunch of cautionary tales, but I think all the points that were made were valid and need to be considered. I take perhaps a more optimistic view in the sense that I view any system to have trade-offs. And so fundamentally, a decision needs to be made, I suppose, by each society. What trade-offs are reasonable? What trade-offs are acceptable? What is the opportunity cost? So every point raised was, I agree with completely. There is a whole lot of potential for these types of technologies to lead us wrong. But I also think that there's a risk in not pursuing them because there's a lot that they have to offer. So sometimes during these discussions, I find, some of the people listening and asking questions will tend to take it towards paradigms like Skynet. And so I would like well, I think it's really fun sometimes to have those far futuristic discussions. I think it would perhaps be more helpful to ground it in what is available now and in the near term. So talking about narrow artificial intelligence, talking about applications of machine learning, like natural language processing for the classification of product types on a shipping manifest, or using computer vision to estimate crop yields based on satellite images, right? So fundamentally, I'm approaching it from a standpoint of service delivery and providing information for policy development. I don't know anything about military applications or enforcement, and so really focused on the service delivery and the information aspect. The drivers, in my view, are those of the expectations. I think as citizens have experience with various tech giants, they develop certain expectations of seamlessness, of convenience, of service. And I think they're translating those expectations to government. And so public servants are expected, are required to do more with the same resources, or sometimes with fewer resources. And so there's really a business case there, I think, for leveraging these tools for the sake of productivity. Now, of course, guardrails are critically important. I think Tom talked about the different approaches. You know, Europe, perhaps a little bit more regimental, the US and Israel, somewhat more open. Canada's taking perhaps middle of the road approach. We have, as you probably know, we're a confederation, and so we have overlapping jurisdictions, provincial, federal, municipal. And so that creates certain challenges. And so we've largely taken a standards-based approach, I think. So you've got Canada's Digital Charter and the Directive of for Automated Decision-Making coming out of the Treasury Board. Within our organization, Statistics Canada, we have developed the framework for responsible machine learning, as well as a quality assurance framework, in keeping with the profound responsibility we have to respect the trust that's been given to us by Canadians and to respect their privacy expectations. Now, as an employee of the Government of Canada and Statistics Canada, I've taken oaths. I've taken, and I take those oaths quite seriously, and I do feel the weight of that obligation. Having said that, if we're having these types of discussions, I think it's sometimes interesting to entertain mildly heretical ideas. And so during the course of this discussion, you know, my approach to it is to speak as an individual rather than on behalf of the organization. I don't mean to represent their views. And so one of the things that I struggle with personally is the paradigms that we're working with. It seems to me as though you can reduce risk, but it's asymptotic. So the more steps you take to reduce the risk, the more you're reducing the risk, but it's never going to be zero. And so what is that optimal point? And I feel as though we haven't necessarily had that discussion with our citizens in a very open way. It seems to me as though the privacy expectations that we have perhaps date back to the 19th century. The way government typically works was largely developed in the 20th century, and now we're in the 21st century where everything is different in the sense of the availability of data and the digitization. And so the question becomes, if we were to design a government from scratch today, what would it look like? And how do we reconcile? I think Harry brought up a really great point, talking about the difference between what citizens show themselves to be comfortable with and the use of the services of these global online platforms from a lack of privacy standpoint and their stated preferences. Those two are diametrically opposed. And so I think I struggle with reconciling those two, because it feels like the expectation is that governments deliver services at a very high standard in a very efficient way, but with both hands tied behind their back. So I think there really needs to be I would argue that there needs to be a much better job about candidly discussing these trade-offs and trying to understand what those risks are and what risks are acceptable and what risks are not.
Christos, thank you so much. I'm going to actually start the conversation where you ended off there, but just to recap there, very interesting. Different countries will, I think, kind of resonate with what you say there about the governance challenges, depending on how they are structured as well. So in Canada, you have the kind of the confederation. So you have those different kind of governance challenges, the framework approach then and the standards approach then. But what you said about very much placing trust and the public kind of considerations about privacy at the heart of everything you do, but then that leading on to that conversation I want to come on to now, but also interesting as well that you started by saying AI is already used successfully in a lot of policy areas. And I think that's something actually that a lot of officials even aren't aware of. So I think we'll come back to that as well, that, you know, people talk about these very big ones that hit the headlines, but actually AI and automation is being used very successfully in lots of policy areas already. But thank you so much for all your presentations. And I want to then start the conversation with something that Christos talked there about, that conversation with citizens, an honest conversation about risk and benefits and the trade-offs. And my question, I guess, was, how do we even start that conversation? Are we having effective communication and consultation with our citizens around automation and AI and what the potential benefits are, as opposed to whether we can or cannot mitigate entirely some of the risks involved? Are we having those conversations? Does anybody have examples of how we're doing that? And how could we be doing it more effectively? Tom, I'm going to come back to you, because I think of everybody, you're the more we must get on with this and we should be doing more. So I want your sense on, in Israel, do you think the public are more aware maybe of AI and how it's used than in some other countries?
So it's funny, while Christos was talking, I just remembered that maybe a month and a half ago, I was meeting with Minister Champagne in Canada, who's kind of responsible for a lot of the good work on AI there. I think that in terms of the public being aware, unfortunately, I think the public is made aware of all of the scary, terrifying, big picture pieces of AI that are going to take away our jobs, that are going to, I was reading a Twitter thread about a microwave that was given AI and tried to microwave its owner. I mean, it's fine. Again, these discussions are really, it's very entertaining. I spend hours on TikTok watching them, right? But at the end of the day, you know, there are my push is that there are real solutions that need to be put in place, and I don't think that the public understands really how AI can and needs to kind of help bolster their lives. And then you mentioned kind of that we only hear the big stories. Speaking of regulators, the latest story that I heard, not latest, it was a few years ago, but how the Dutch government basically implemented significant AI algorithms on their welfare and tax systems. And the result was not great. The algorithm kind of suggested that certain groups and people should get refunds that they weren't supposed to get, and vice versa. Folks that did not deserve got refunds, and the regulators had to quit. The government, I think, even had to quit entirely. And so it's there's a lot of these cautionary tales. And so I'm not saying that oh, we should just ignore all of these cautionary tales. Just gung-ho go into implementing AI, but I think it was Christos or Harry that said that, you know, there are very specific kind of contained use cases for AI that can be implemented. I think those specific cases Christos mentioned in agriculture, there are places where you need to implement it, and it's very easy to do that. And then maybe one additional point is just on the whole question of discrimination. And I think testing those solutions and monitoring them in the public sector is a big undertaking, because the public sector, you know, knowing a little bit of how it works, right, I wouldn't be as trusting that they would be as diligent about knowing and testing and making sure that there isn't any problematic discrimination, any problematic outcomes. And so I think the bar is very high for public sector officials to make sure that the algorithms work. And so I'm not belittling that responsibility. I just think we need to put a lot of effort into making it easy for them to implement it.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Jeremy, I'm going to come to you on this issue of communicating and consulting the public, because you mentioned there was a consultation going to start, I think, on one of the use cases, the children's safety one. But to what extent do you think that conversation that Christos was alluding to, having an honest conversation with the public about AI, but also I want to ask as well, an honest conversation with civil servants around how AI maybe is already being used, where it should be used, where it shouldn't be used. So your thoughts on communication and consultation, both within the public sector and to the wider public.
Yes, no, I think this is really central to being able to use AI in government, and as others have been saying, that it's a bit tricky because we are held to higher standards, but at the same time, I used to work on linking together different data sets to then being able to use AI to do research or make better decisions. And when we tell the public that do you have permission to do that, they say, well, why aren't you doing it already? So sometimes it's difficult. It's difficult to really get that balance right. And then there's the role of the media as well, which is a very different agenda and can shape public opinion in ways that are not always helpful. I think the other thing when having those conversations is that it's easy to see the risks of doing something, but it's easy to miss the cost of not doing something, of not seeing the lives that we could save, and that essentially people that we're not saving now because we're not using AI, health, quality of life, education, everything. So it's really important to bring everything into perspective. In terms of the conversation with the public, I don't think we're doing enough. And what we need to do is to really have a structured approach and a differentiated approach to engagement. So in Scotland, for instance, we're about to launch a MOOC, a massive online course, which is going to be called, it's supposed to be called Demystifying AI, but now I think the working title is Living with AI, although it does sound like a condition. Anyway, we need to work on the title, but again, to sort of manage expectations and bring people away from the extremes of the extreme hype, for people who have something to sell, or people who are worried about Skynet and the like. We are about to embark on a rolling program of public engagement on separate themes, because I think to just ask people about AI in general, you're just not going to get a very productive conversation, because it will get dominated by a few voices on a few topics. And then also targeting audiences. For instance, we've just started a program of work around AI in children. I mean, children have a huge stake in AI, because whether they like it or not, they're going to live in a world where AI is going to play a much bigger role than in my generation. So we're doing a lot of work to engage with them, working with the Children's Parliament and the Alan Turing Institute, which is a big research institute in the UK around this. We're organizing school competition. We're bringing them to challenge our speakers at the Scottish AI Summit. There's ways to engage, but you really have to make it differentiated. You really have to make it concrete, so that people are not only informed, but are able to make a meaningful contribution that then, as government, you are able to use in your work.
Thanks, Jeremy. So Christos, I'm coming back to you before I go to Harry, but Christos, on this issue then, you raised the issue of this conversation. What are you doing in Canada to have that conversation with the public? And equally, are you having a conversation across the government as well, so that civil servants get a better understanding of how AI can be used safely?
Certainly. So there are multiple tables, multiple exchanges of views. My division leads the data science network for federal public servants, where we get those implementing data science together, and we share best practices and use cases. And policies designed to ensure that whatever's being put out is safe and responsible. In terms of the consultation piece, there have been a number of consultations. My personal view is that we tend to play it safe, because in the sense that there's just too much risk of having the open discussion about everything that could go wrong, because you don't want to unduly alarm people. That would be wholly irresponsible. And the climate we're in, the media climate, is somewhat sensationalistic. So you could see things going wrong really, really quickly. Nevertheless, I do think that needs to happen, because without having that open discussion, I don't know how you land on something that isn't necessarily unnecessarily restrictive and denying citizens all the benefits of these technologies.
Yeah, thanks, Christos. I can see Harry nodding there, I think, to that. So Harry, would you like to see a more open, honest conversation with the public about those potential risks, but albeit with the benefits as well being very clearly put forward?
Sure. I mean, I guess before I come to that, just a couple of words to contextualize where I was coming from, because I get the impression that I'm going to be rubbing up against people's tech optimism for the duration of the session. I think that's partly, I see that's my job, but you know, the institution for which I work, the Ada Lovelace Institute, our organization objective is to make data and AI work for people in society. We are presuming that there is benefit to these technologies. But we also think it's quite a high bar, and a bar which isn't jumped over as a default. There's a lot of work on the part of regulators, on the part of industry, on the part of society and politics as a whole to find a configuration for these new technologies such that they genuinely are beneficial. And we don't believe that the line of least resistance when it comes to the incentives of markets or the incentives of public service necessarily lead us there without a lot of concerted effort to make sure that happens. So that is just a bit of context where I'm coming from. And if my my comments about some of the risks and the downsides of these technologies seem harsh, it's because I'm trying to push for that sort of conversation, not that I don't see any benefit. On the question of the conversation between the public and policymakers, I think it's incredibly important. I think what I would stress is it needs to be a two-way conversation to be a genuine conversation. I think there's a tendency in some parts of government, and you can talk to some civil servants, to see public concerns about AI and emerging technologies in general is a barrier, and a barrier that can be overcome if the public can be disabused of their misconceptions about different technologies. And I think getting communication right and not scaremongering is obviously incredibly important. But I think that sometimes you get the impression that we are trying to configure, or hoping that we can configure, public moral sensibilities to suit our technologies, rather than thinking hard about how we get our technologies and the way that we're deploying them to suit societal values and priorities. So I think sometimes we are missing the other direction. One tool which we are a big fan of at the Ada Lovelace Institute, and which goes in the other direction, so aims to inform policymakers about informed public sentiment and priorities when it comes to emerging technologies, particularly AI, is deliberative public engagement. So we've run sessions, and this is obviously a well understood methodology, but we've done sessions on the use of biometrics, for instance. I'll be doing one this year on the looking at the intersection of artificial intelligence and genomics, and how those technologies might be used to provide fairly accurate predictions of people's future healthcare needs, and what that means for how we deliver healthcare at a public level. So I think there are certainly tools that can make this more of a genuine two-way conversation. I think that's something that often doesn't get enough emphasis.
Thanks, Harry. Well, one of the things that Harry did say in your opening presentation, Harry, was that You probably can't get rid of humans entirely anyway, regardless, that there'll have to be somebody monitoring this. But I want to ask our three government kind of representatives here, because the question that we get most from our audiences, who are overwhelmingly civil servants from different countries, is their concerns that AI is just going to remove the need for them. It's going to take away their jobs. So the very simple question we had is, will AI replace my job? So I want to put this to Christos, to Jeremy, and to Tom. So in that order, Christos, is AI going to take away civil servants' jobs?
I think we need to look at the time horizon. If we're talking about what's going to happen in 200 years, I would argue possibly, but I have no certainty because it's so far out. If we're talking within the next 10, 15, 20, I would argue that it will not, because fundamentally you will always need people, not only for checks and balances, but there are certain things that humans are better at and will continue to be better at. And so I think you might have a bit of a shifting or pivoting, but no, I don't think that our workforce will be replaced by AI.
Thanks, Christos. Jeremy, what do you think on this? Do you agree with Christos?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to put it in perspective. I mean, AI is just another technology. You know, for hundreds of years, we've had innovations, you know, from mechanical looms to all sorts of products, to even, you know, 30, 40 years ago in government, we had, you know, typing pools, and everybody is expected to type on a computer. So, you know, things evolve. They evolve at different paces as well. I remember when New Zealand released their AI strategy, they actually considered that displacement of workers was not an issue, because they believed that it would happen slowly enough that essentially the labour market would adapt in good time. So we are very conscious in Scotland that, you know, there will be transformation, that some segments of the job market are going to be affected, and we're keen to ensure that those jobs, those people can find employment. But yeah, I don't think, I mean, at the moment, even, you know, ChatGPT, DALL-E and all this, you know, sometimes people worry about artists, and Nick Cave was saying that he thought that it was just a terrible idea, but, you know, they're huge correlation engines at the moment. You know, deep learning, that's all it is. Yeah. It's never going to replace humans for most of what we want. And in terms of public services, you know, the last thing we want is to reduce the human interaction with our citizens. So yeah. It's quite a complex question. Anyway, I'll probably stop there. Yeah.
So complex question. Dan, do you agree with Christos and Jeremy, or I'm slightly nervous about asking you this one. Do you think it's going to replace?
No, it's a question that I've thought a lot about, mostly because so there's I think a lot of the jobs that exist today will be eventually taken away by AI. I think there are going to be a myriad of new jobs that will be needed. And new training and new programs will be needed in order to get people to get on board with that. There's the great British economist, I think, Thomas Malthus, in the 19th century, thought that did a very simple calculation, looked at all the agricultural lands, divided it by the output by the number of people, and came to the conclusion that we're all going to die from starvation as the population continues to grow. Not taking into account that you know, we're adapting, and technology has a way of improving the output of agriculture, and really at the time, right, everyone was working either in agriculture or in some related field, and so as we went through each of the revolutions, whether it's the Industrial Revolution, the computer web 1.0, 2.0, 2.0 revolutions, etc. The types of jobs that we do have changed, and the existing jobs that continue to be done have all changed, you know, to an unrecognizable degree. I was just talking to my grandmother, and my grandfather worked for 50 years in a paper factory that doesn't exist anymore. And so it's I think that jobs will change, but whether there will be need for jobs, I think it's pretty clear that there will be.
Thanks, Tom. I can't believe how quickly our conversation has gone. We've just got time for one more question that I'm going to put to all of you. What I'm actually going to do, there's two questions here. I'm going to ask the two questions, but you can choose whether you answer one or very quickly both, but you'll have to keep your answers quite brief, I'm afraid. So the two questions we have sent in advance were, how do you see the application of AI progressing? And are there any areas where you don't think it will ever be appropriate for AI technologies to be deployed? So that's one question. And then the other one was a kind of, from a civil servant, a kind of lacking, based on past experience of historic failures of large IT projects in the civil service. So do the civil services even have the ability to bring in these new technologies effectively? So a kind of confidence thing based on past experience of IT failures. And then do you think there are any policy areas, I guess, where AI will never be appropriate? You can answer one or very quickly both of those questions. I'm going to go in reverse order. So Jeremy, I'm coming to you first.
Yes, I mean, I think, to be honest, I think the private sector is just as bad as IT projects as we are, but the difference is our failures make the front page, whereas failures usually in the private sector just get swept under the carpet. So I would say that we shouldn't feel that we can do that, but I think pardon me, as Tom was saying earlier, this is also about recognizing that the private sector has a lot to offer and that we need to work with them on those solutions. So, but yeah, I would say, keep your courage.
Brilliant, thanks, Jeremy. Tom, your thoughts on one or both of those questions?
I'll take the second one. I think when we think about public servants, I think Jeremy's point is correct. The private sector, especially big enterprises, are just as bad as the public sector. The problem is that it's not being done with public money, and so Verizon implements a bad AI engine in the U.S. It's their shareholders and their customers that are paying the price. But here it's really public funding. How do we encourage the public sector officials to understand AI and really get to know it? It's a lot of training. B, putting more money into their salaries so you can bring AI and IT literate public servants, because you can't do it with the current degree of salaries. And I think those two in combinations are going to create an improvement. Until we do that, it's very dangerous, because you have public servants who some of them want to introduce a lot of progress, but at the end of the day, if they don't understand the material, what ends up happening, or what could end up happening, is these opportunistic companies come up with their sales pitches. You want the public servant to understand which is a Ponzi scheme, which is a BS proposal, and which is an actual solution that's been proven that it exists and can be implemented in the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Treasury, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Harry, you can answer both, but I imagine you would possibly have views on, are there any policy areas where you don't think AI would ever be appropriate?
Yeah, not surprisingly, I do have thoughts on that, and I'm not going to step on the toes of those who have worked a lot more have a lot more experience from within government on that question. I suppose in terms of the direction in which I think AI is going to be developing, I think what we might see over the next decade or so is limits to deep learning, machine learning algorithms, because we are seeing the limitations in terms of their domain specificity. I think we're already seeing limitations in terms of attempts to make these systems more generalizable. There have been some really interesting attempts to develop hybrid systems. So systems which will both use symbolic AI, where systems are following decision trees, which is a far more kind of traditional way of developing artificial intelligence, and combining that with neural networks and deep machine learning, and which have produced some quite interesting and durable results. So one example is Meta has a program called Cicero, which can play a game called Diplomacy, which is a very complex game involving negotiating with other players, trying to convince them to do other things. And I think that's a space certainly to watch in terms of how this technology is developing. I think probably given everything I've said about some of the limitations of systems we have currently, both technical limitations and the fact that these systems can be quite good at concealing value judgments, I think, and I will leave it to your audience to infer what might be bad applications of technology. I think there are a few, and I think it's probably better if I don't just provide a list.
Yeah.
Try and provide a really basic set of tools for deciding whether some are responsible and irresponsible deployments of their technology.
Brilliant. Thanks, Harry. Christoph, the final word to you on one or both of those questions.
I think I'm going to tackle the first one. The public servants that I've spoken to and worked with on this all deeply feel a heavy responsibility based on the trust that's been conferred to us by Canadians and a profound obligation to live up to that trust. And so, well, I tend to be perhaps a little bit optimistic in the sense that I am hopeful that if we were to put the case of to Canadians or to the citizens of our various countries, they would perhaps choose to embrace some of the efficiencies and the capabilities and also acknowledge some of the risks. I do firmly believe that there's a whole host of applications where leaving it to AI would be completely inappropriate and very undesirable and undemocratic. So in that sense, I think I'm firmly in Harry's camp.
Well, thank you so much, Christos, and thank you. I'm afraid that is the end of our time, but a huge thank you to all of you. Brilliant panel there, really interesting conversation. To Christos, to Harry, to Jeremy, and to Tom for giving us your time, but also I think setting out quite clearly the potential, the huge potential for AI and automation, but also some of those challenges I think that the public sector in particular have to grapple with in terms of thinking about those possible risks and pitfalls as well. So lots for the civil servants to be thinking about, lots of food for thought there. We will share on our website this video so that our audience can watch this at their convenience. They can share it with their peers and their colleagues as well. And there will also be a write-up of today's conversation, today's webinar, with the key points that have been raised in the discussion, and that will be available on the Global Government Forum website as well. But it just leaves me to say again, thank you very much to our fantastic panel. I wish you all a brilliant day, the rest of the day, wherever you are, and thank you to our audience for watching this webinar as well. Thanks very much, everybody, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you, Siobhan.
Thank you, Benita.
Thank you.